It was late autumn when Claire began to notice him. She had always taken the same route home from her evening classes, walking the dimly lit road past the convenience store, then cutting through the narrow street where the old bus stop stood. At first, she thought nothing of the man who lingered there, a tall figure in a heavy coat, his face hidden behind the hood of a sweatshirt. He never boarded the bus, never seemed to be waiting for anyone. Just standing, sometimes with his hands buried in his pockets, sometimes staring down at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. What unsettled Claire wasn't his presence, but the strange timing. No matter what day, no matter what hour she left class, he was always there. She tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just restless, someone who liked the quiet of the night. But after the third week of walking by him, she noticed something else, the subtle shift of his head following her movements. It wasn't blatant, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of her neck. One night, as she passed, she caught the glint of his eyes beneath the hood. They were fixed on her, unblinking. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing on the empty street, and for the first time she felt the deep, crawling sense that she wasn't just being watched, she was being studied. The first true sign came one Friday. Claire stayed late at the library, finishing a paper. By the time she packed up, the streets were emptier than usual. She told herself that maybe tonight he wouldn't be there. But as she turned the corner, the silhouette was waiting under the flickering bus stop light. She crossed the street to avoid him, walking briskly, trying not to glance back. Then she heard it, a second pair of footsteps syncing perfectly with hers, crossing when she crossed, slowing when she slowed. She forced herself not to run. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a warning drum. When she finally reached her apartment door, fumbling with the keys, she heard the footsteps stop. Silence. She whipped around, but the street was empty. The following days only worsened the feeling. Claire began catching glimpses of him in places that didn't make sense. At the grocery store parking lot, leaning against a lamp post, watching. Across the quad at her university, half hidden behind a cluster of trees, as though he wasn't supposed to be seen. Each time, he vanished before anyone else noticed. Claire stopped telling herself it was coincidence. She started avoiding her usual route home, circling through brightly lit streets, even calling friends while walking just to hear another voice. Still, the dread remained, the gnawing certainty that no matter how far she strayed, he was there. On the night it escalated, rain poured over the city in a constant sheet. Claire left class early, clutching her umbrella against the storm. As she hurried past the bus stop, her eyes widened. He wasn't there. Relief washed through her chest, though only briefly. Because when she reached her building, standing under the overhang by her apartment door, was the same figure. The hood pulled low, water dripping from his coat. She froze, unable to breathe. Slowly, he tilted his head upward, revealing the shadow of a smile that stretched too long, too deliberate. That was the moment she realized he hadn't just been following her home, he knew exactly where she lived. Claire slammed her apartment door shut and threw the lock across, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Her clothes were damp from the storm, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped her phone. She wanted to call someone, her best friend, the police, anyone, but the thought of explaining what she'd seen stopped her. She had no proof. He hadn't touched her, hadn't spoken a word. All she had was a shadow under a hood and her own gnawing fear. She pulled the curtains shut and sat in silence, straining her ears for any sound beyond the pounding of rain against the glass. That night, sleep evaded her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past weeks in her head. Was he waiting for her to notice? Was this some kind of sick game, pushing her deeper into paranoia before making his move? Around 3 a.m., just as her eyes began to grow heavy, a sharp sound jolted her upright. Tap. 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 At first she thought it was branches against the window. But then came a pause, followed by another deliberate knock, this time harder, unmistakable. Someone was outside her bedroom window, her apartment was on the second floor. No balcony, no fire escape. There was no way anyone should have been able to reach that window. Slowly, with her heart hammering against her ribs, she slid out of bed and crept toward the curtains. Every instinct screamed at her not to look, not to give him the satisfaction. But curiosity and terror twisted together, dragging her closer. She pulled the curtain back just enough to peek through. For a fraction of a second, she saw him, his hood dripping with rain, his pale face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and wild. His lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. Then, as her gasp escaped her throat, he vanished into the storm. The next morning, sunlight did little to ease her dread. She checked the ground below her window and found muddy boot prints smeared across the siding, leading up from the alleyway. Her stomach turned as she realized he had climbed the drainpipe just to get close enough to watch her sleep. Claire finally called the police, her voice shaky as she explained everything. The officer on the other end was sympathetic but careful. "Unless he threatens you directly, ma'am, there isn't much we can do. Keep your doors locked. Stay somewhere safe if you can." The words felt hollow, like a rehearsed script she wasn't meant to find comfort in. That evening, Claire packed a small bag and decided to stay at a friend's apartment across town. She tried to convince herself it was the right decision, that putting distance between them would break whatever hold he seemed to have. But as she stood outside waiting for her friend to pick her up, her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. It was a picture. Her apartment window, taken from the alleyway below, framed in rain and shadow. And beneath it, 3 words typed with chilling precision: "See you soon." Claire barely slept at her friend Marissa's apartment. Even though the extra locks on the door and the company of another person should have comforted her, the image of his face at her window replayed endlessly in her head. She couldn't shake the look in his eyes, like he already owned her, like this was inevitable. Marissa tried to reassure her, saying it was probably some stranger who'd lose interest if ignored. But Claire knew better. Stalkers didn't just stop. They escalated. The following morning, Marissa offered to drive Claire back to her apartment so she could grab a few more clothes and essentials. The streets were washed clean from the storm, sunlight bouncing off the wet pavement. For a moment, the normalcy almost felt believable. Claire even allowed herself to laugh at one of Marissa's jokes. But when they reached her building, everything inside her chest went cold. Sitting in her mailbox, slid neatly into an envelope with no return address, was a single photograph. It was a picture of her taken at the bus stop weeks ago, before she had even realized she was being followed. She was standing under the flickering light, head tilted slightly, her bag slung over her shoulder. In the background, blurred but unmistakable, was his silhouette. A message was scrawled across the bottom in uneven handwriting: "You looked beautiful that night." Claire's fingers trembled as she held it, bile rising in her throat. Marissa snatched the photo from her, muttering curses, but Claire couldn't hear her. All she could hear was her own pulse roaring in her ears. They went to the police station immediately. Claire laid the photo on the officer's desk, her voice cracking as she begged them to take this seriously. The officer, a tired-looking man with deep lines on his face, studied the picture, then sighed. "It's disturbing, yes. But he hasn't broken in, hasn't harmed you directly. We can file a report, but unless you know his name or have a clearer shot of his face, our hands are tied." The words hit Claire like a slap. She realized with sickening clarity that she was truly on her own. The law wouldn't stop him, not yet. That night, Claire returned again to Marissa's, refusing to step foot in her own apartment. As she tried to sleep on the couch, she kept replaying the officer's words. "Unless he harms you." The loophole was almost a dare, an open invitation for the stalker to push further. Her phone buzzed again past midnight. Another text from the same unknown number. This time, it wasn't a picture. It was a video. Her own apartment door, filmed from just a few feet away, the camera lingering on the lock as though testing it. At the very end, before the screen went dark, came the sound of a man's low chuckle, quiet, deliberate, and Claire stayed at Marissa's for several more nights, but the sense of safety was only an illusion. Every creak of the floorboards, every passing car outside the window sent her nerves spiraling. The stalker's messages had stopped for 2 days, but that silence was worse than the taunts. It meant he was planning something. She carried her phone everywhere, her eyes constantly scanning crowds, searching for that hooded figure. Even in daylight, paranoia clung to her like a second skin. By the weekend, Marissa convinced her to return to her apartment long enough to collect important documents and some belongings. They went together, sticking close, both pretending they were braver than they felt. The building was unusually quiet, most of the tenants away for the holiday weekend. The silence was oppressive as they climbed the stairwell, the sound of their footsteps echoing up the narrow halls. When Claire slid her key into the lock, her stomach dropped. The door was already slightly ajar. Marissa grabbed her arm and whispered, "Don't go in." But Claire couldn't stop herself. She pushed the door open, her breath catching as her eyes darted across the small apartment. Nothing looked stolen. The couch cushions were untouched, the television still there, her books neatly stacked. It almost looked normal, until she reached the bedroom. On the neatly made bed lay a single item, one of her shirts, folded carefully, with a Polaroid photo placed on top. The picture showed her and Marissa from the night before, sitting together on the couch, taken from outside the living room window. Claire's knees buckled, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Marissa cursed under her breath, pulling Claire toward the door, insisting they leave immediately. But before they could, Claire heard it, the faintest sound of movement. A creak of floorboards in the hallway outside the apartment. Both women froze, exchanging terrified glances. Someone was out there. Slowly, they edged toward the door, but the sound grew louder, steady, deliberate footsteps pacing just beyond the threshold, as though the stalker was circling them in silence, savoring their fear, summoning every ounce of courage. Marissa yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. Only shadows stretched across the faded wallpaper, lit by the dull glow of the ceiling light. Still, the sense of presence was undeniable, the hairs on Claire's arms standing on end. As they rushed down the stairwell, Claire felt it, the prickling certainty that he wasn't gone at all. He was there, somewhere in the building, watching them retreat, enjoying the fact that he could get closer whenever he wanted. Claire refused to stay in her apartment again. After finding the Polaroid, she packed her things in a rush and left with Marissa, her nerves frayed to the point of exhaustion. But in the days that followed, her life became a blur of anxiety. She skipped classes, avoided familiar routes, and jumped at the sound of her own phone notifications. Every moment felt like waiting for the next move in a game she never agreed to play. Marissa begged her to go back to the police, but Claire couldn't shake the memory of the officer's dismissive tone. To them, she was just a paranoid girl with no hard evidence. On the fourth night at Marissa's, Claire stood at the living room window, staring out at the rows of buildings across the street. The city lights blinked in the. Claire tore herself away from the window, her pulse hammering in her ears. She told herself it could be anyone in that opposite apartment, but deep down, she knew. It was the same stillness, the same way he stood like a shadow made solid, watching her as though the glass between them didn't exist. Marissa tried to calm her, insisting it was probably just some neighbor, but Claire couldn't stop trembling. She refused to look back at the window for the rest of the night. The following day, Claire skipped her classes again. She couldn't bring herself to leave Marissa's apartment, pacing the floor while Marissa went to work. Around noon, she heard a knock at the door. Relief surged through her, maybe Marissa had come back early. But when she peered through the peephole, her stomach turned to ice. The hallway was empty. Just as she stepped back, another knock came, louder this time, deliberate. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. For nearly 15 minutes, the knocking came in intervals, sometimes at the door, sometimes at the window facing the fire escape. Claire kept her back pressed against the wall, clutching her phone in both hands. She finally dialed Marissa, whispering into the receiver, "He's here. I know it's him." Marissa urged her to call the police immediately, but Claire hesitated. By the time anyone came, he'd be gone. That was his pattern. Show himself, vanish, leave her doubting reality. The silence afterward was worse. Hours passed without another sound, and for a moment Claire convinced herself it was over. As dusk settled, she gathered the courage to move toward the kitchen. That was when she saw it. A folded piece of paper slid halfway under the door. Her body froze, her mouth going dry. She crouched down with shaking hands and pulled it toward her. The note was scrawled in the same uneven handwriting she'd seen on the photograph. "I like this place. Cozy. Easy to get in." The phone slipped from her grip. Claire backed away from the door, staring at the note as her chest heaved. He had been inside. Maybe not today, maybe not now, but at some point, he had crossed that threshold. Marissa found her in that state when she returned, clutching the note like a lifeline, unable to form coherent sentences. For the first time, Marissa looked truly afraid, her confidence gone. She locked the door twice over, but both women knew the truth. Locks meant nothing to him anymore. Marissa didn't leave Claire alone after the note. She insisted they stay together in the apartment, even if it meant missing work. For a while, the companionship gave Claire a thin thread of safety to cling to. They kept the curtains drawn, the lights dimmed, and the doors double-locked. But paranoia seeped through everything. Every creak in the walls, every gust rattling the window frame felt like his presence pressing in. Claire had the sickening realization that this was exactly what he wanted, her world shrinking smaller and smaller until she felt like prey trapped in a cage. That night, exhaustion dragged them both into uneasy sleep. Claire dozed on the couch while Marissa stretched out on the bed in the next room. The apartment was silent, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Sometime past midnight, Claire stirred awake to an unfamiliar sound. At first, she thought it was the pipes groaning. But then she froze. It wasn't the pipes. It was breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. And it was coming from inside the apartment. Her eyes darted to the shadows near the kitchen. The room was too dark to see clearly, but she could feel the weight of someone there, hidden, watching her. Claire's chest seized up, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she tried not to move. The breathing grew louder, closer, until she swore she could feel it against her skin. Desperate, she fumbled for her phone, the screen lighting up her trembling hands. That tiny glow caught something in the corner, a flash of pale skin, the faint curve of a face. Before it melted back into darkness, Claire screamed, the sound tearing through the apartment. Marissa bolted out of the bedroom, flipping on the lights. The room was empty. No open windows, no doors ajar, no sign that anyone had been there. But Claire's terror was undeniable. She was shaking so violently Marissa had to grab her shoulders to keep her steady. "He was here," Claire sobbed. "I heard him. I saw him." Marissa searched every corner, every closet, but found nothing. To anyone else, it would have seemed like hysteria. But then Marissa noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the floor by the couch, just inches from where Claire had been sleeping, lay a single cigarette butt, still faintly warm. Neither of them smoked. The discovery of the cigarette butt was the final straw. Claire refused to spend another night feeling like prey inside Marissa's apartment. She wanted to run, to disappear, to cut ties with her entire life and start over somewhere far away. But Marissa, ever the steadier one, gripped her hand tightly and whispered, "We're not running. We're ending this." Her voice was firm, though her eyes betrayed her fear. The two of them sat in silence for hours, the weight of the decision pressing down like a stone. Finally, they agreed, they would set a trap. If the stalker wanted to break into the apartment again, they'd be waiting. The plan was simple. They would leave the apartment dark, curtains open just slightly to mimic their normal routine, then hide together with their phones ready to call for help. Claire hated every second of waiting, her body thrumming with adrenaline, but a small spark of determination burned within her. She was tired of being hunted. Tired of the helplessness. If he came tonight, she would finally see his face, finally get proof. The hours stretched unbearably long. Midnight came and went. Claire's body ached from crouching in the cramped space behind the bedroom door. Marissa kept whispering reassurances, though her own hands shook so badly she had to hold them still against her knees. Then, just as Claire's eyelids grew heavy, she heard it, the soft scrape of metal at the front door. Her entire body tensed. The knob rattled once, twice, and then the door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside, moving with slow, deliberate confidence, as though he already owned the place. The figure moved straight to the living room, pausing in front of the couch where Claire had slept the night before. For a moment, he just stood there, staring down at the cushions, his breathing audible even from across the apartment. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. She could see him more clearly now, the hood pushed back just enough to reveal greasy hair, a sharp jawline, and a grin stretched too wide. He turned, scanning the apartment with predatory patience, and began walking toward the bedroom. Toward them, Marissa clutched Claire's hand, urging her silently to hold still. They stayed frozen as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until his shadow loomed in the crack beneath the door. Claire thought her lungs might burst from holding her breath. Then, without warning, the handle of the bedroom door began to twist. Slowly, deliberately. The moment of confrontation had arrived. The bedroom doorknob rattled once, then again, harder this time. Claire's fingernails dug into Marissa's arm as the two women pressed their backs against the wall, praying the lock would hold. But the stalker was patient no longer, he wanted in. The handle twisted violently, followed by the sound of his shoulder slamming into the wood. The frame groaned with each hit, the door trembling as though it would give way at any second. His breathing was audible now, heavy and eager, and for the first time, Claire heard his voice, "You can't hide from me forever." The words were low, almost playful, but they curdled Claire's blood. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slippery with sweat, and managed to dial 911. Whispering into the receiver, she begged the dispatcher to send help immediately. But she doubted anyone would arrive in time. With each violent impact, the wood splintered more, shards scattering across the carpet. Marissa picked up a lamp from the nightstand, gripping it like a weapon, her eyes blazing with a mix of terror and defiance. Another slam, and the lock tore from the frame with a sickening crack. The door burst inward, smashing against the wall. He stood there at last, filling the doorway. His hood was gone, revealing greasy dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide with manic delight. The grin he wore was worse than any mask, a grotesque parody of affection. He stepped inside slowly, savoring their fear, his gaze fixed unblinking on Claire. Marissa swung the lamp with all her strength. The base connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back, but his laughter filled the room, low, guttural, unshaken. He advanced again, his hands outstretched, fingers curling like claws. Claire scrambled for anything to defend herself, her vision swimming with panic. The dispatcher's distant voice crackled on her phone, "Ma'am? Stay on the line, officers are on the way." But she knew seconds felt like hours, and survival would depend only on them. The stalker lunged. Marissa screamed. The lamp shattered. And in the chaos, Claire grabbed the first object her hands touched, the jagged remains of the broken doorframe. Her heart hammered as she braced herself. The predator who had haunted her every step was finally here, and there was no running anymore. Only fight or die. The stalker lunged, his hands reaching for Claire, but adrenaline drowned out her fear. With a cry that tore from her throat, she drove the jagged piece of wood upward. The splintered edge sank into his side, and he howled, staggering back. For the first time since this nightmare began, Claire saw something break in his expression, not delight, not control, but shock. Marissa seized the moment, swinging the shattered lamp base into his head. He collapsed onto the floor, thrashing, blood spreading across the carpet in a dark stain. Claire dropped the wood, her entire body shaking violently. She half expected him to leap back up, laughing as he always did, but this time his movements slowed. His breaths came ragged, wheezing. Yet even as he lay bleeding, he lifted his head, eyes locking onto hers, and whispered, "You're mine. Always." The words clung to the air like poison, burning into her memory. She stumbled backward, tears blurring her vision, until the wail of sirens cut through the night. The police arrived in a rush, bursting through the shattered door to find the two women trembling, cornered, and the stalker writhing on the ground. Officers restrained him with practiced efficiency, dragging his body into the hallway. Claire couldn't look away as they pulled him past, his grin faint, still lingering, even as he was cuffed and shoved into the back of a cruiser. The paramedics checked Claire's shaking hands, the shallow cuts on her arms from splinters, but she barely felt them. All she could feel was the weight lifting, slowly, heavily, but lifting nonetheless. In the days that followed, Claire moved out of her apartment. She deleted her number, changed her routes, and tried to piece together a semblance of normalcy. But the damage lingered. Every creak of a floorboard still made her flinch, every shadow in a window felt like a pair of eyes. She never went anywhere without scanning the crowd first, always searching for that familiar face. Sometimes, she swore she heard his laugh in passing, only to turn and find no one there, but she survived. That, she reminded herself each morning. She survived him. He had taken her safety, her sense of normal life, and twisted it into terror, but he hadn't taken her. The scars would remain, both visible and unseen, yet in her survival lay a truth stronger than his obsession: he was finished, and she was free. For the first time in months, Claire breathed without fear, though in the quiet hours of the night, she still wondered if his words had been a promise or a curse.